So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well as mental.
Hi, Katie.
It feels like it's been a minute since we've been here. For our listeners, it's just been 2 weeks, but...
Right. Time. What a trip.
Time. Oh, that weird week between Christmas and New Year's where all you do is eat cheese.
Right.
Oh. Oh.
All right. So, are you saying that a good suggestion is that maybe we should be exercising while we listen to our podcasts?
No, I definitely think that would make us sound a lot like breathier and huffier.
No, not while I'm recording. That would be terrible.
Oh,
when I'm listening.
Listen to the podcast and work out. Love it. We'll help you achieve your New Year's resolutions on
the Holy Watermelon Podcast. Speaking of time, we're looking way back.
We're going in the way back machine.
We're going to look at what is generally called the ancient Greek religion, but I mean, there's some serious problems with that label.
And it has some other names as well, which we'll get into. But we are starting, I guess, like a little series of dead religions.
Yeah. Most of them have been revived in interesting ways.
Because
but they did
solidly
pretty much fully die.
Disappear. Yes. Because people, there's definitely revival of these, but yes, they were definitely put to rest almost completely at one point or another.
I think broadly we can call this whole series for these ancient religions as the victims of Christianity.
Oh, actually, I like that.
There's a couple exceptions, or at least one looking forward in my memory, but broadly speaking, they're the victims of Christianity.
And we're going to actually do a full wrap-up episode on what constitutes a dead religion, why religions die out. So we'll get more into that in a few months' time, because I think we're covering about 6 of these.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so.
We do plan ahead.
We do plan ahead, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, so we talked about how Shinto was kind of a weird case where it wasn't really looked at as a religion, but just kind of a folk tradition.
It's kind of what it means to be Japanese for a very specific period of time.
Right.
Less so recently as we've kind of globalized, but there was centuries where that's just what it was to be Japanese.
So it's kind of the same thing with being Greek. Polytheism lends itself well to this sort of issue where it's just how you exist in the community. It's kind of weird.
I also think and we see this in Shintoism, when you have deities for very specific reasons, it makes it, I guess, easier to explain or justify, which is sort of this thing we see with the Abrahamic God where, we see the argument all the time where we say he's a loving God, but then how did the Holocaust happen? Or, this is God's will, but how, why are there dead babies? And that gets hard to explain. But when you have a polytheistic model, you can say, well, this is this one's fault because they are, the god of war, chaos, or death. And in this transaction, they won.
Right. Yeah, the most common solution for that problem in polytheism is that gods are almost never seen as almighty. It's just kind of, they can influence certain things, and sometimes they get to do their thing unchecked.
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of nifty and interesting stuff.
Again, similar to Shintoism, there was no overarching body governing this religion, which is kind of part of the reason it doesn't. It still falls under religion by our definition, but not like a religion we see today, and no real texts at all.
Yeah, there was no the Pope of all of the Greeks. That wasn't a thing.
No. And there was no holy book.
Not really, no. You had a lot of traditions, and some of which obviously got repeated more than others for being stories that were either better told or more relatable or more useful for a particular scenario. But there was no scriptural canon at all, really.
If you've taken the classics in university, you would have divided.
Read.
You would have read the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer, which is kind of as close as we get to formalized texts. But I think most people know them as we're writing down stories.
Pretty much.
We're writing down this oral tradition.
A lot of what we have in, let's say, the Hebrew Bible, for example, is canonized simply because they were really popular texts and they became part of the cultural literary canon, kind of like Charles Dickens for English people. Homer is exactly that, and very useful when looking at the traditions around the gods, because that's what he was talking about an awful lot of the time. It's kind of nifty.
Yeah. All right, words guy. Words fella.
Which word are you looking at?
Hellenismos.
Hellenismos?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically just a fancy word for Hellenistic paganism. Hellenism and Hellene basically meaning Greek, Greece. Why we call them Greek in English is just really weird.
It's like India.
It's like, why do we call Germany German when that's not what they call themselves?
Yeah.
It's a weird thing. That's the way it goes. So very often when people talk about the Olympians and everything that surrounds that worldview, Hellenismos is the word that gets used.
And just a note on the Hellenistic paganism. This is not sort of the witchy paganism that we associate. This just means not Christian. The paganism.
Yes,
piece.
paganism is broadly
in the term of
non-Christian,
Hellenistic paganism. It just means not Christian in this case.
Hellenistic paganism does specifically mean Greek flavored.
Right, but I just don't mean the witchy version of paganism that we've sort of adopted.
Yeah.
This is the clarifying I am doing.
Perfect.
Are you
I think I'm with you.
You're with me?
Okay.
Are you with me, listener?
All right. The interesting thing that we really have to emphasize, and we'll probably say it a few times, there is nothing monolithic about the Hellenic traditions. It's not one organized religion. That's not the reality at all. It's a whole bunch of traditions of a whole bunch of subgroups that happen to fit together in a semi-cohesive fashion that was reinforced by the state for peace reasons.
And it's all centered around a family bush.
Yeah, what a bush it is.
What a bush it is, which we'll get into. That's when you mean semi-cohesive, right? Where you're like, they're all inbred.
I mean, inbreeding helps with cohesion a little bit.
Really makes a solid family unit. With Uncle Grandpa.
I'm my own grandpa. Good old Zeus. Nothing's good about Zeus.
No, we could do. Actually, I was thinking we should do an entire episode on Zeus. There's so much.
We could. There's a lot to talk about.
Which we will not cover all today. But
I mean, if you want a very brief overview, Wikipedia will scratch that itch.
So will Zeus if you let him.
You don't have to let him. Zeus is all about his own satisfaction and not so worried about consent.
Yeah.
Also, not strictly limited to humans. This dude was all over the place. He had an itch to scratch, and he let everything scratch it.
Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, Preston. Let's get back to this cult tradition. And then we'll get into
so each of the gods that we're going to focus on, all of the Olympian 12, and even 12 is a problematic detail.
asterisk.
Each of these Olympian 12 had a position as the focus of at least one smaller cult tradition before they were lumped into the Olympian pantheon. Some of them had multiple cults. Some of them, it's kind of weird to look at them as having a distinct cult, but there was a cultic reverence for them.
And I just want to clarify,
Yeah.
not danger cult, just a small grassroots religious movement.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
danger cult.
We've talked about cults before, and this is a good time to emphasize, because the word is going to be used a lot if you were to go reading into scholarly articles on this. Cult is the word that is used to describe the group of people who are organized worshiping a figure. And yeah, so this is the way we look at these gods. The primordial deities of Hellenism, we don't actually see a lot of cults built up around them, but we see a lot around the Olympian 12.
Which we'll dive right into.
Yeah.
And of course, this Greek religion spread beyond the borders of Greece. It didn't just stay put to some of the neighboring islands. And of course, it spread to Italy.
Yeah.
Which we will talk about in next episode, I believe, is
Yes.
our Roman one. And there are tons of parallels, which we'll talk more about next week. There are numerous gods and goddesses in this pantheon.
There are so many.
So many. And like we said before, these gods are immortal, but they're not necessarily all powerful or benevolent.
Right?
Again, I mean, obviously there's contradictions to this in the Abrahamic faith, but generally it is assumed that God is all loving, forgiving, a benevolent God. Not the case.
Right?
With rapey Zeus. Or there's some others too, but
There was a wonderful, fun film put out by Disney, feels like forever ago.
Hercules?
I think it was the mid-90s. Yeah, Hercules.
Yeah.
And there's one figure in the whole movie that lines up with the way they ought to have been according to the mythology that's existed for these people for millennia.
Is it the satyr?
It's Phil. Phil is the only one who's reasonable, and actually he's not even that close because you never see Phil's wang.
It's Disney. They have to censor some stuff.
Narcissus was pretty much what you would expect him to be. Everything else is either missing important defining characteristics or is fully the opposite of who
what
they
should
really
be.
are.
And I guess sort of to that point, gods can interact and mate with humans. A perfect example is Heracles or Hercules.
Yeah, Heracles is the Greek one. Hercules is the Latin name. So having Hercules, the son of Zeus, and Hera is fully wrong. But Zeus had a son named Heracles, who was not Hera's son. This is an important part of that figure's story. I actually love it. The name Heracles was given to him. The name means calls on Hera. So it's supposed to appease a very angry Hera who is constantly suffering because her husband is constantly cheating on her in very aggressive fashion.
I mean, we're going to get to this, but I think that's what you get when you marry your brother.
It shouldn't be a risk, but I get it.
I think it should be a risk when you marry your brother, because what brother wants to marry his sister? Of course he's going to sleep around.
I mean, do you think this was a situation where he was forced to marry his sister because his sister wanted to marry her brother?
I don't know.
I don't know. That part of the story is a little fuzzy.
All right. Anyway, this is like his soap opera, and we just keep getting sucked into their love lives.
I mean, there's so much literature on these people because people feel exactly that way.
So let's back up the boat and talk about who these Olympians are, where the name comes from, why we care about them, and who the 12 are, and then we'll get into some of their dirt and gossip. So there are 12 asterisk kind of 13 Olympian gods, and they're named thus because they reside on Mount Olympus. And this is sort of I won't say the one, but this is kind of core across this religion, that's kind of all agreed upon. Everything else kind of, I won't say, it will change depending on your culture, tradition, or location or story you heard. But the fact that these 12 asterisk 13, live on Mount Olympus, and our little family bush is generally canon.
Yeah, it looks like the Olympic union of this set of gods is mostly a product of people deliberately trying to keep a nation unified, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
The king of the gods, the All-Father, as he is often called, is just an absolute pervert. He's the god of the sky and of thunder. He's the god of law and order.
Dun, dun.
I thought it was really interesting.
This is Zeus. You haven't said Zeus yet. You just started talking.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought I said...
You didn't say Zeus.
Zeus.
This is Zeus.
Okay. So Zeus is actually mentioned in the Hindu Rig Veda.
Oh.
Yeah. Zeus is called Deus Pita, which, if you're really into Latin and Roman mythology more than Greek, that should sound like Jupiter, and that's not an accident. The name is derived from the generic word Deus, meaning God, and the specific Latin Jupiter makes this combination, and it becomes Sky Daddy.
Yes.
Pita being father, as you see in most of the Proto-Indo-European languages. It's kind of nifty. So Zeus is the Sky Daddy.
Yeah, he is. And he likes to be called Daddy, too.
Yes. Like I said, he's the All-Father. Even
All
if you're
pervert.
not a natural descendant of Zeus, it is expected that you refer to him as father. You see this through all the old classical literature, that all the gods refer to him as father, even when that's not the case.
Call me Daddy.
Yeah. He is one of the original Mycenaean gods, originally from the island of Crete, which I thought was kind of nifty. There is talk in some old sources of him having a tomb on the island of Crete.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I would be really curious about that because we talked about this a long time ago, that a lot of gods and deities are based off of real people.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there was a Zeus that
That's
turned into this. I'd be concerned if there was a Zeus because all these stories are horrible. But
Yeah, I'm curious how many of them are outright fiction and how many are based on real people.
I hope more fiction than that. But.
I hope.
Number 2 of the 12 is Hera. She's the goddess of marriage, women, and childbirth. She is Zeus's wife.
And sister.
And like Preston said, contrary to what you see in Disney, she's not the mother of Hercules. Hercules is so named to make Hera love the child.
Didn't work out.
Hera may have been the first of the Greek gods to receive a covered temple and seems to be the first of the Olympian gods to receive such a structure on Mount Olympus.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. That's a thing I don't have a lot more information on, and as I was kind of rushed to put Hera together in my notes, but I thought that was kind of nifty.
I think it's great.
Poseidon is really interesting. Of the big 3 that people like to talk about in Greek mythology, Poseidon is the big wet brother of Zeus. He is the god of the seas and earthquakes and storms and horses. He's Zeus's brother. He's the middle brother. Hades was the oldest brother, but after being ripped out of Cronus's guts or being puked out, Hades became the youngest. But Poseidon, straight up, all across the board, the middle brother.
So the least loved brother.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Nobody
Nobody likes the middle child.
I don't know what the relationships were with their mother, but their father hated all the children, so...
Well, we'll get to that.
He could have lost out worse.
Yeah.
I still feel weird about Poseidon being called an Olympian, being more of a ocean fella.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't reside on Mount Olympus. I thought he lived in the water.
I've never thought of him being a resident of Olympus, but Dionysus is also not really a resident of Olympus, but he's an Olympian, kind of.
Yeah.
It's weird. But Poseidon rules the sea just like Zeus rules the air and Hades rules the underground. The earth is the common ground between all of them, so they're all welcome on Olympus unless they're specifically exiled from it. Hades not usually welcome. Even though he's not a bad guy. Anyway, discussion for another time. Or at least later on in the episode. So I thought it was really interesting that Poseidon was one of the major Peloponnesian gods before he joined the Olympians.
Interesting.
And some versions of the story have him as a horse.
That makes sense. The
Like,
images in my
is.
brain is him riding a horse in the waves.
Yeah,
Or a
that's a pretty
seahorse,
common
yeah.
image, yeah.
But I like that he is an actual horse.
Yeah.
Nay.
In fact, in Arcadia, there's a tradition that he and Demeter are a married pair of horses. And that's kind of nifty.
Aw,
Yeah,
that's cute.
right?
Which brings us to Demeter, who is the goddess of harvest, fertility, nature, and the seasons. She has a secret cult festival called Thesmophoria, and only women are allowed to participate. No
Yeah.
boys allowed. Put up a
Right.
sign up on the door.
It's not much of a secret anymore, but when it was happening on the regular, it was pretty top secret.
She was one of the Mycenaean goddess initiatic tradition in Eleusis, focused on the story of Hades and Persephone. Which Persephone doesn't even fall under these 12. She's one of the...
No, she's one of the minor gods.
I know, but there's so many names
So
that we're
many.
not going to get to.
Yeah.
And in the Arcadia story that Preston was referring to, Demeter has a mane of snakes, kind of like Medusa.
Yeah. Scary horse. You would not want to try and
know.
jump on the back of this horse. Yeah. What a really interesting set of gods. Next on our list, we have Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, and naturally the patron goddess of Athens. Most traditions have her being born from Zeus's forehead without sex, which is extremely weird for the extremely rapey Zeus. Hesiod says that her mother is Metis, and that Metis actually gave birth to Athena inside Zeus, and that's how she popped out of Zeus's forehead. It's a mess. It sounds super gross.
I wish you could see the face I'm giving Preston.
Yeah, the Greeks had some really interesting stories. In fact, if there's anything that you could say is universally Greek, it's the telling of epic stories.
Yes, that's true.
Everything else is a lot less universal.
Great food.
Fair. That's fair. Okay, there's probably a few things that are broadly Greek. So Athena is the perpetual virgin. This is actually really helpful as a symbol of a protected city because she is originally an Aegean palace goddess and existed in identical forms in different cities under different names until the name Athena won out with the rise of Athenian power and the spread of the Attic dialect.
That's interesting.
Right?
Athena's a badass.
Absolutely.
And I
she
actually
is.
will say, like, in more modern, and I mean, particularly the Abrahamic tradition that can be quite misogynistic, there's definitely an equal, if not more, female gods. And they're all badass.
Yeah. What
At
is
least
really
of
interesting.
the 12, rather.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you got down to the nitty gritty, I don't know what the statistics are, male to female. But of the 12 Olympians, I think it's pretty much half
It's
and half.
pretty close to balanced. And Athena, being a goddess of warfare, she actually specializes in military strategy, which differentiates her from the next guy on our list.
Well, and I feel like that falls into the wisdom piece of
Yeah,
her.
it does.
As well. Ares is our next guy. The god of war, bloodshed, and manly virtues.
Strength and courage,
And muscles.
but issues.
So he is the son of Zeus and Hera. And instead of the military strategy, which is Athena, as Preston mentioned, Ares is rough and brutal. He is a common personification of the strength of war, but this specific version originates in the Mycenaean. Despite the raw power that he is meant to represent, most stories leave him embarrassed.
Yeah, think back to him being on the Trojan side of the Trojan War.
No.
Yeah, things actually very seldom go well for Ares when he's part of the story. Even though he's, say the more recent stories like in DC Comics, for example, where he is a truly epic and powerful dude. I mean, yeah, he's powerful, but he always gets his butt kicked by a non-god.
Loki? Is that you? Most sacrifices to Ares were offered after victorious battles through a practice of young men sacrificing dogs.
Yeah, it's a little gross and sad.
Before a manhood fight was adopted from the cult of Annihilus. Did I say it right?
It'll do.
And cults to Ares were not that common unless you were a military group, but they did exist. Making the neighbors uncomfortable, Preston.
Well, I would think so.
You don't just want people sacrificing dogs and having manly man fight club fights in your neighborhood?
Well, even just...
I assume it's like Fight Club.
Just imagine knowing that... Just knowing that your neighbor worshipped Ares, the god of war. Wouldn't that make you feel a little bit weird about that neighbor?
In present day, yes, it would. I don't know about past day, but yeah, probably. We saw a weird nationalist truck on our errands today. I was like, this makes me uncomfortable. So yeah,
right?
It's that guy.
It's that guy. It's perfectly fine to recognize that, in a nation that is very often at war, having reverence for Ares is perfectly valid. But belonging to a cult specifically dedicated to him is a little bit different. And
that's
feels a little
fair, right?
weirder.
That's different. It goes beyond just the sacrifice before a battle. It's like a
Right.
different level.
It is.
Of creepy.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Next on our list, we have Apollo, the god of light, truth, arts, the sun, manly beauty, medicine, and honestly, a terribly long list of other things. Anything that's good, Apollo is connected to it in some way, really.
He's a good guy. Good guy, Apollo.
Yeah, basically. He is the son of Zeus and Leto, and he actually wasn't fully conflated with this, didn't become a sun god, wasn't conflated with Helios until very late in history, which I thought was interesting. Apollo's cult is most interested in prophecy. You'll hear a little bit about Delphic oracles when you dive into Greek mythology, and this is tightly attached to Apollo. He's also one of the oldest gods in the pantheon, and may have even been part of the cultic traditions of the pre-Hellenic people before they were divided into groups more familiar to us as, humans spread out further west into Europe, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
He is also called the most Greek for a few reasons. He is the ideal of manliness, and so this is definitely informing this choice a little bit. He is also recognized throughout the Hellenic territory by more or less the same name, give or take, accent and
Apollo.
and linguistic evolution. But yeah, it's like some vowel shifts here and there, but broadly speaking, more or less the same name for a really long time backwards in history, which I thought was really nifty. And so he is the patron of two rival cults, both fully established before any religious history was recorded in the area, which I thought was also really nifty.
That is really cool. Artemis. Did you know Artemis is my favorite?
No. Why is Artemis your favorite?
I don't know. I just liked her as a kid when we did Greek, and I think it was grade 6.
Okay.
But because she was the moon and the hunt and archery.
So I think her being associated with the moon is a deliberate parallel to Apollo and the sun. Selene is generally the moon, if I'm recalling correctly and not mixing up my mythologies. And when Apollo became conflated with Helios, Artemis was at more or less the same time connected to the moon.
Yes, and that is because she is the twin sister of Apollo.
Exactly.
So she has the same parents, Zeus and Leto.
Mm-hmm.
Artemis was the protector of forests throughout Greece. So like little hippie Katie really liked that. And she had several local cults and was very important in Sparta specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Her first cult was likely established on the island of Delos. And her temple in Ephesus is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
So that's
How
some
cool is
major
that?
kudos for Artemis.
Oddly enough, she is Artemis is a perpetual virgin, but also associated with childbirth.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of a
She's like a
interesting
midwife.
situation.
She's
Yes.
a midwife.
There's a story that she helped with the delivery of her twin brother.
I feel like I've heard that.
And mechanically, that sounds like
Literally impossible.
totally fantastic. But there's also, I'm looking to a parallel in the Hebrew scriptures where there was twin brothers and the younger brother came out with his hand wrapped around the ankle of his older brother. And so it just kind of pulled out. And that actually makes it kind of easy to believe that this story could have been based on a baby girl who just happened to be holding brother's ankle on the way out kind of deal. And ended up, baby brother came out right after with that tug around the ankle. Who knows?
I'm not an obstetrician.
No, me neither.
But it's
This
a
is
cute
not my
story.
field. But it as much as it sounds weird in the basic story of baby helped deliver a baby.
But there are other stories.
Yeah, there's weirder stories.
There's weirder stories like a whole virgin birth.
Which we have talked about pretty recently. Aphrodite is next on our list. So she's the goddess of love, pleasure, protection, lust, sex, and also motherhood's on that list in a lot of places too.
And she's the one coming out of the clamshell, that Renaissance painting. Yes, girl.
Wasn't that Venus?
Oh, it was, but they're the same.
I mean,
is
to a lot
Venus.
of people, they are exactly
You're
the
right,
same.
it is Venus.
According to Homer, Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and the Titan Dione.
So Zeus had sex with his aunt? Yep.
Yep. I mean, Zeus had sex
With
with
his sister.
almost everybody that he
Almost
could.
everybody.
There's not a lot of stories of him having sex with men. That, you know what, now that I'm saying that, I probably need to go back and look.
Probably did.
There's probably... I'm thinking of the list of all the people he's had sex with who there was a child that made the story noteworthy. There's probably a separate list that I just didn't look at.
Of just his conquests.
Right.
The notches in his bed frame.
Exactly. Because homosexuality was not an issue in Greece. That wasn't
Not
a
at
problem.
all.
It was day-to-day life for the average person. Just casual sex all the time.
Plato's The Sexes actually places homosexual men as like the apex because they've chosen to give up family. So if you were to like rank people, it was like homosexual men, heterosexuals, and then lesbians.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Lesbians are the worst. I'm kidding. It's not a personal belief. That's what The Sexes says. And we have no problem with lesbians here at the Holy Watermelon Podcast. That was not enthusiastic enough, Preston.
I didn't know that you were going for it, but I saw the pause and knew you wanted me to say it, and I wasn't ready. But here we are anyway.
Oh, let's see if that makes the final cut. So tell me about Uranus.
Oh, yeah. So according to Homer, Zeus and Dione are the parents of Aphrodite. But according to Hesiod, Aphrodite was formed from the foam that leaked into the sea from Uranus's severed genitals after he was castrated by Cronus.
Wow.
So we have very different origin stories here. And we can't say that one of them is more authoritative than the other because we still have the vast majority of humanity saying this is fiction anyway.
There you go.
But what a weird story. Castrates Uranus, throws his junk out into the Mediterranean Sea, as far as we can expect it to
You can't see what I'm doing, but it's inappropriate.
And the white foamy juice that comes out of those nuts.
Sea foam.
Sea foam.
It's just sea foam, kids. This is getting an explicit rating.
This is how we get Aphrodite.
This is how we get an explicit rating.
That's the way it goes. So Aphrodite's cult was primarily a syncretization of very similar cults to other mother goddesses from further east. And it actually looks like Aphrodite basically is the same figure as Ishtar, as evolution brought it further east. Or further west, rather.
Hephaestus is, and this is one I actually haven't heard of. Like, we have these two we'll get to that are kind of like, they get swapped in and out. But I've never heard of Hephaestus. So anyway. He is the god of fire, the forge, blacksmiths, and volcanoes. Hephaestus is the son of Hera and the cuckold husband of Aphrodite. Homer says that Hephaestus was thrown down from Olympus for defending his mother from Zeus's sexual advances, kind of like our boy Ganesha from the Hindu tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And Hephaestus is crippled after a poorly executed superhero land. Is that the superhero pose that we see everyone do?
Yeah, maybe. Poor guy just could not handle that kind of toss.
No. In another version, Hephaestus is born crippled, and that's why he's thrown down from Olympus. His identity as a crippled smith is commonly attributed to the ancient memory of metalworkers who suffered from arsenic poisoning due to working with cheap bronze.
Gross.
Yeah. History really has like crippled a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. It's
just
weird
from
that
like
it's
not knowing what you're working with.
Right. It's kind of interesting looking back through history that there is this kind of, it looks like just a narrative trope that the blacksmith is a cripple in some way or another, but it actually makes sense that if you look at the work they do and the things they're dealing with, arsenic will straight up give you cancer, and there's loads of opportunity to hurt yourself when you're messing around with hot metal.
What? Yeah. So there isn't much for cults for Hephaestus, more of general reverence from metalworkers, blacksmiths. And shrines to him were typically attached to other shrines or temples.
Hermes is next on our list. And the last of the Olympians that everyone agrees, yes, he's an Olympian.
So we're at number 11.
Yeah.
Because 12 is debated.
Yes. There's issues. We'll deal with that in a minute. So Hermes is the messenger of the gods. He's the god of communication, travel, diplomacy, games, all kinds of stuff. He is the son of Zeus and the Pleiad Maya, because Zeus be getting around. He is a trickster, which I thought was interesting, but we don't usually actually emphasize that detail of his character. But he's a prankster and messes around with things, and his visits are not very often good visits, though occasionally he'll come in to bring you news like Gabriel or whatever. But he also leads the souls of the dead to the underworld, which sounds like a problem when you know he's a trickster.
Oops, JK!
Right? Here's a practical joke. It went wrong. Guess you're going down to Hades with me.
Hey!
Problems.
You're not laughing.
Yeah, things could go pretty rough for anybody who meets Hermes. You never really know. Hermes is also incredibly old, predating the Hellenic tradition. Some scholars see him as coming from further east with Aphrodite, and that he was specifically her messenger. But of course, things evolve and change as we tell more and more stories about things. His cults were mostly in small rural communities. You didn't see a lot of cults to Hermes in the city until later on in history. And he is now thought to be a variant of Pan, the good old satyr god.
Ooh.
Of course, when I say good, I mean fun and interesting, not righteous and just.
No. Satyrs are not known for that.
No.
So we come to our first There's a word that I don't have, but it's in my
Disputed?
brain. Yeah, that's a good word. We come to our first disputed
Yeah.
god of the Olympians.
Everyone seems to agree that there's 12 Olympians, but depending on who you talk to, you get different lists.
And literally it's just like these two that we're about to talk about get swapped out.
Yeah.
That's it.
So easy enough to remember.
So nobody like doubts that Aphrodite is part of this. It's literally these two. Anyway.
Yeah.
So the first one's Hestia, the goddess of health and domesticity. She is a virgin goddess, which is surprising because she's Zeus's sister. We know how much Zeus likes his sisters.
Right.
So that is impressive. She doesn't have much of an individual cult, but she was respected anywhere a fire would burn. There are 2 known temples attributed to Hestia, and they don't bear any depiction of her, though.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting that you will almost always find great paintings or some sort of iconography saying this is who you're looking at and dealing with, whether it's carvings or full-on sculptures or just something. And that's not the case with Hestia. You see writing and whatnot, but there's no faces in the 2 temples that we know of her.
Her sacrifices, and we'll get more into sacrifices as a practice a little bit later on, were offered primarily in the home by mothers or at public buildings, offered by civil authorities. And one of the ones I read is that you just like give some of your dinner to Hestia to make sure that, which makes sense, right? Domesticity and health, that give her a scoop of your potato salad. I assume they ate potato salad in ancient Greece. Probably not. I don't think mayo was a thing.
Doesn't mean you can have a different kind of potato salad.
I guess so.
I don't know if potatoes... I mean, my experience of potatoes with Greek food is fully limited to
potatoes.
The restaurant experience.
That's true. Is it dinner time at our house? Probably. You give her you give her a scoop of and that's your offering to her. So I can see that being kind of a daily or weekly practice.
Absolutely daily, several times a day. Any sacrifice that was being offered, whether it was to Zeus or Poseidon or Hermes or what, if you're offering to any god, it is proper form to offer first to Hestia.
Interesting.
And she's the only one who gets to eat before Zeus.
Wow. She was the older sister then. I don't know, but that's the only thing I can
Zeus
see.
was the baby. He was the last of all of Cronus's children. And Hades, I think, was the oldest. But they all came out in reverse order when Cronus spewed them back out again after eating them.
Okay, really good. We'll get to that, I presume. Who's our number 13?
Dennis. Good old Dionysus, or Stanley Tucci, as we've pointed out before. Because some of our audience, I'm sure, is fully aware of Percy Jackson and his family situation with the Olympians. And good old Dionysus was played by Stanley Tucci, and we love Stanley Tucci.
Stanley Tucci, if you're listening, would you please be a guest? Thanks.
Yeah, it would be wonderful.
I've put a few of those shout outs into the world. They haven't come back yet, but they will one day.
One day.
Yeah.
So Dionysus is the god of wine, fertility, and frivolity. Because he is the god of epiphany, especially opioid epiphanies, he is often called an outsider and a foreigner. Though history shows him being one of the oldest gods in the area. He's not really an outsider, but he brings us outside knowledge in a format very different from Hermes.
Yes, and I can see why people might be wary of that.
Right? I mean, a lot of these gods actually do have strong connections with the poppy, and definitely that means opium in at least some of the situations. And that is the case with Dionysus. Mm-hmm. He actually isn't the god of drunkenness with wine. The cults of Dionysus always encourage moderation when it comes to drunkenness, but definitely also love to hand out opium. So
you take a sip of your wine and chase it with your opium.
Exactly.
Or I guess you take your opium and chase it with your wine.
Sure.
I don't drink enough.
I'm not part of the drinking culture.
I know. That's an episode one day.
Sure. Dennis, I love calling him Dennis just because that is the English form of the name Dionysus. Dionysus has
Dennis, the menace.
yes.
Oh,
He has several cults, all of whom hosted fantastic festivals. And according to a bunch of scholars that I've been reading lately, the modern theater is credited as developing from their practices.
cool.
Yeah.
Love that. So this dispute. So Hestia is omitted in favor of Dionysus by people who don't think Hestia counts as a goddess. What?
Yeah, it's kind of sketchy, but that's the deal, I guess. When she's the only one who gets to eat or drink before Zeus, that's a bold claim.
Bold claim. And then Dionysus is omitted in favor of Hestia by people who count Dionysus as a foreign wandering god.
Which is a position that's easier to defend, but is tricky. I think I put it in my notes later on, actually, that there is some talk that Dionysus is actually not his main persona. That Dionysus is actually Hades.
Oh.
So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, let's jump to Hades and come back to that point.
Let's do
because
it.
Hades is actually a big omission. I think
Right?
if you did a family feud of name
the
of
Olympians,
the Olympians, a lot of people would say Hades.
even though he's technically not on the list.
He's not on the list.
I think he should be. And if you say that he is Dionysus and that Dionysus belongs on the list, then bam, Hades is on the list.
That is a very roundabout way of getting someone into a club.
Right?
But let's talk about Hades, because he is, again, he's not one of the 12 Olympians. Even in our disputed category, he's not one of them.
Right.
But he's a big player.
He's
really the
is.
brother of Zeus.
Yeah. And it's weird that he is usually treated as an outcast. He's the king of the underworld and god of the dead. Not to be confused with the god of death. That is Thanatos. But Euripides, one of the old classic writers, actually disagrees and says that Thanatos and Hades are the same figure. But he's wrong, and he's dead, and he can suck it.
Wow. Hot take from Preston.
So myth tells us that he is the oldest son of Cronus, which made him the last to be thrown up, as we've mentioned twice or three times now at this point. It's kind of a big deal for the mythology, is where these people came from. Hades is not the bad guy.
Unlike Disney.
Yeah, everything you learn from Disney's Hercules is wrong. Everything. Hades is a good guy for the most part. At the worst, he's cold and just kind of distant. Compared with all of the other gods of Olympus, the Hades illustrated in myth is the best fit for a Christian or secular idea of morality and justice. So it kind of turns the way we look at things all on its head. Zeus, who in the Disney version is more or less kind of forced to transform into the Judeo-Christian god, who ends up being painted like Trump in that gross spray tan orange, is the worst version of a role model. Hades is actually much better. A lot of people try to avoid saying the name of Hades because you don't want to attract the attention of the dude associated with death. So you get all kinds of nicknames given to him, which was really a very popular tradition anciently across a lot of tradition and across a lot of cultures. So because precious minerals come from under the ground, Hades was called Pluton, which basically just means rich, which became a very popular name used instead of his proper name, and actually is the source of the name Pluto that we have for the same figure, more or less, in the Roman tradition. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So offerings that were made to Hades weren't typically burned on an altar the way you see a lot of other gods' offerings being received. Instead, they were dropped into a hole in the ground, which is oddly more familiar in Mesoamerica. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But offerings to the underworld obviously need to go under the ground. But you always got to be looking away because you don't want to look at...
You don't want to see them.
Right. That would be bad
it's like a
news.
basilisk.
Sure. I mean, death comes to those who see Hades, or has already come to those who see Hades. So you got to be looking away, which means this hole isn't just a little hole in the ground because you don't want to miss when you're looking away.
You just have to keep doing it over and over again.
You've been wasting a lot of food.
Wasting a lot of food.
And wine. So much wine. But I thought that was really interesting. And that some scholars will say that he is Dionysus, and that's how he kind of sneaks into an Olympian status sometimes. Because that is where I had the note. And the Orphic cult, which is also tightly tied to Dionysus, actually flips that and says, no, Hades is actually another persona of Zeus. That they're kind of coexisting in two different aspects. The Orphic cult is a pretty good example of how you can see that the Greek tradition is not homogeneous, it's not monolithic, it's a whole bunch of different traditions that kind of just loosely fit together.
Like Christianity.
Christianity's become pretty well organized.
Yes, but if you look from denomination to denomination, beliefs vary wildly.
Yes, they do. So, in fact, that's mostly why they are different groups, is arguments about details.
Fair enough. So before we move on to what, I guess, a day-to-day ritual religious practice looks like, I just want to talk about the Olympians. Because Zeus is not the first god. He's not a creator god like we have in the other... in other religions. The Olympians are actually third and fourth generation immortals. Mm-hmm. So how the hell did third and fourth generation immortals become top dogs?
By killing everyone who came before them.
Titanomachy!
Yeah.
That word is not shouted as Titanomachy. I feel like our listener
Titanomachy.
I just shouted it. It might not have been as clear. Which the myth is that it was a 10-year god war in Thessaly, and the Olympians fought with the Titans, and the Olympians won. So the Titans would be the previous generations, which I just want to say makes the Olympic Games sound a lot fucking cooler than it is. Sorry if you're an Olympic athlete, but let's be real. Shot put.
I mean, if you're imagining the shot put ball, the shot that you are putting,
wow,
as, say, the head of a Titan.
Okay, I mean, that's pretty. Now
with a little imagination, this does get pretty epic.
I'm going to watch the Olympics through a whole new lens. And when they want to bring on new sports, if I can't see how it would fit into a Titanomachy, I'm nixing it.
I mean...
Because they wanted to get rid of judo, which is like the OG Olympic sport, and very useful in a 10-year God War.
Right? Whereas men's ribbon gymnastics...
I don't think that exists. You're making that up.
Men's ribbon gymnastics is a real thing, thank you. And if you're using it as a celebration after the battle, that makes more sense.
Ping pong.
When you're just messing around with the entrails of a disemboweled Titan. It's looking kind of gross, but here we are anyway.
I like it. Synchronized swimming. How does that one work in a God War? We've derailed this episode.
We have so far.
But I need you to explain synchronized swimming in a God War to me.
Well, there was a Titan of the sea that Poseidon was definitely very useful in fighting.
Oh, so it's like a war drill.
It's gotta be.
A war drill. Perfect. It can stay.
Yeah.
I will call the Olympic Commission and tell them it can stay. There is, sort of to our point about Zeus being really rapey and like 3 and 4 generations of immortals, there is a very good but very confusing family bush on Wikipedia.
Yeah, and I found that on Wikipedia after I saw you posted it in our notes. And I've found less exhaustive but easier to follow family trees all
Bush.
over the place.
Don't even call it a tree.
Yeah, it's a bush. There's so much intertwining. Honestly, because Zeus has sex with about a quarter of all of the people in the tree, there's a lot of crossing of lines. It's a mess. But it is actually pretty nifty to see how all of this is connected. And we'll talk a little bit more on what that might actually mean towards the end of the episode.
Does this mean Zeus did it with Poseidon?
No, that's listing them as brothers.
Oh, no, you're right. I don't see the arrow to him. Never mind. Okay, so let's see. Zeus and Demeter. Zeus and Leto. Zeus and Hera. Zeus and Mnemosyne. Zeus and... So many. So what did it look like to be a practitioner, air quotes, because this was just day-to-day life, of the ancient Greek religion, which we also know is a misnomer?
Yeah, there wasn't one really, well, using the word religion just feels weird. Honestly, it probably looks like your average person today, apart from the nature of their employment. Farmers would go out, work in the farms, and they would make the occasional sacrifice, just like the average farmer will go to church on Sunday.
Yeah.
It's not wildly different, really, which is kind of nice. Humanity is really pretty much the same all the time.
We definitely haven't changed a lot in the last 1,000 years, like how our brains are made.
Right.
It's like we haven't changed at all, which is kind of scary. But the Greek religion was focused much more on practices and rituals than beliefs. So if you could walk the walk, nobody really cared much if you believed in it. There was none of this come to Christ moment,
Right.
Born again Christian stuff. This is just what you do. It's how you brush your teeth. You give a sacrifice to your God. It's what you do to get through your day.
Yeah. There were altars and temples erected both in the home and larger temples like the Parthenon. And you were meant to leave offerings to the god or goddess of your choice. If you were traveling abroad, it was the correct thing to do to make an offering to the god of the place you were visiting. And in a polytheistic system where you recognize that there are more gods than the one you worship, that's not even weird.
No.
You just do it, which is why people were so pissed off of the Christians who refused to do it.
It's also, and we'll get more into this in our episode wrap up in a couple months, but it's also, I read that's one of the reasons that it died out, because they were happy to accept on their end another god. Okay. But that obviously wasn't reciprocated. So it was really easy for them to start believing in an Abrahamic God, but then also very easy for Christians to start stripping them of their other gods.
Yeah, it was a little messy.
So this is just kind of classic worship stuff. You leave a sacrifice for your God. They'll do something for you in return.
Mm-hmm.
Sacrifices, libation was very popular. So you pour wine.
Pour one out for the homies.
Pour one out for the homies. One for you, one for me. Raise a glass. We're recording this on the day of Betty White's death.
Man.
I was
very disappointed to read that this morning.
Yeah, so she'll get a libation tonight. Exactly that. Honey and milk, also a common libation. It could be a sacrifice could be something small, like you said, a portion of your dinner time meal to Hestia, or it could be something large, like a cow or a person.
Yeah, human sacrifice was never common in Greece. There are a few old writers who talk about it as a thing that was more common anciently, like before the time of the old writers that we're reading now. And even then, it's starting to look like that's probably not the case.
Read a little bit about scapegoats, which is a term we still have today.
Yeah.
But that they'd have some sort of outsider, and they'd like put all this bad juju on them, and then they would sacrifice them or stone them to death. But again, even in my readings, it didn't sound like it was as common as some people would think.
Yeah.
Heathens don't sacrifice humans nearly as much as you think we do.
Right.
We definitely do, but not nearly as much as you think.
Right. I feel pretty confident that a lot of the throwing folks into volcanoes was probably more capital punishment than sacrifice deal.
Well, I just can't. I can't. I can see it because we have examples like North Korea where scaring someone into compliance.
I mean, it works.
But the origin of religion was to organize a society that can function. So if you have people living in fear that they're going to be the next scapegoat,
that might work.
But I'm actually saying it might not. Like long term, it's not.
It's not
sustainable.
constructive.
Yeah, exactly. So sure, the occasional, why not? But it's not nearly as we should look into.
It's not how you run a
Aztecs
nation.
and Incas, because that's a big belief with Aztecs and Incas that they and Mayans that they would behead and play soccer with your skull. I don't know if that's on our list, but that's one that also gets a big throwing virgins into volcanoes rap.
I feel like using a skull for their sports would actually have made life so much easier because they're playing with those really heavy medicine balls, right?
Yeah,
Like a skull is so much lighter. That would have been actually okay.
And I think, we're digressing a bit, but especially the Central American religions, I bet a lot of that is just pure racism.
Oh, there was definitely a lot of
right,
fiction made to make them look more
like we
savage.
talk about voodoo being this big, it's not a scary religion. It's just people villainize it because they're anti-black. So I bet if we dug into these Central American religions,
They're not Christian, so they're terrible.
so they eat babies.
Yeah. Yay for all of the things. There's so much wrong with the way people talk about other people historically.
Right. So back to the Greeks, though. Sin is not a thing, particularly.
Really, it's not.
And if you read about Pompeii, or is it Herculaneum? There were two cities, and I know Pompeii was I think it's Herculaneum. They were just like the Las Vegas of their time. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So morals in ancient Greece, I won't say they're bad. They were just really loved hedonistic, let's call it.
Hedonism was definitely more or less the way things were operated. There was kind of a universal law of moderation, but that's kind of it. There were some places where failure to be moderate was actually punished, but not really a lot in most places.
I'm pretty sure it's Herculaneum. I'm pretty sure if you go to Herculaneum, there's like runes with dicks.
I mean, that's pretty much humans everywhere.
Everywhere through all time, they drew ancient dicks on the walls.
Well, once we got civilized enough to not be worried about our survival from week to week, we drew dicks on things.
Dick.
Yeah, I don't know why.
I definitely have a dick butt on my fridge now, thanks to Preston.
Yeah.
So we haven't changed at all. Skip that because we talked about it.
One thing that I think is really nifty, though.
Okay.
One thing that I think is really nifty is that there is one, I want to call it the deadly sin. This should be a familiar idea in the English-speaking world, is hubris. This is more than just the sin of pride. This is the extreme height of pride. This is what brought Icarus to fly too close to the sun kind of level of pride. And that's the only reason that gods would smack down people other than for their own entertainment, which was also a real life problem. But yeah, hubris, big bad thing.
Basically, they don't want you thinking you're on par with them.
Right. Gods will occasionally elevate people, especially heroes. But for you to say, I'm like the gods, bad time is coming your way.
Zeus is going to turn into a goose.
And
have his way with
snake his way up inside you.
Yeah, that's your punishment. Which is written fact. There are stories.
Yeah,
That doesn't make it fact, but
it is a historical
story.
Literary detail.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a mess.
Right.
A few of the gods, especially Hera and Demeter, are associated with the poppy, and we already talked about how Dionysus is really into the poppy. There's no shortage of scholars who are very confident that opium was very popular. Each of the gods had things that they would bless people for doing. Some of these acts might offend another god, though. There's no unity among the gods of Olympus, or of all of the gods of the Greeks. And that's just kind of the deal. As I mentioned before, the greatest tradition of Greece is storytelling. And I mean, it's kind of a big deal around the world. And the Greeks have a story for everything. Spiders are awful. There's a story for that. They exist because of a curse put on a girl who would weave better than the goddess of weaving. So, bam, now you're a spider. Now we have spiders.
Wow.
Yeah.
I like that explanation.
The Pleiades look real pretty in the night sky. There's a story for that. They're the children of the Titan Atlas and the nymph Pleione. There's a story.
Sweet.
It's kind of nifty. And there's stories for literally everything in the world. And
what's their story for Canadians?
Oh, that's easy. History took care of that. I'm pretty sure that it's not in their elementary school curriculum.
Okay.
But history takes care of that.
Fair. I just want to hear the ancient Greek story. You said for everything. Yeah. I'm just being sassy. You're like, I don't get the joke.
Nothing.
You're like, I don't get this joke. Clearly wasn't very good.
Canada isn't ancient, so there's no ancient Greek story for Canada. You want to do the Hellenic afterlife?
Do I want to do the Hellenic afterlife? Of course I do.
Okay.
So generally there's a single place for dead spirits in the Greek tradition, unlike in the Abrahamic faith where you go up or down.
Mm.
And this is underground, which makes perfect sense because we, for the most part, bury our dead. Eventually, a few cults start exploring the reality that when men die, they are not equal in virtue. So the truly awful would be segregated to the darkest corners of the realm of Hades, called Tartarus. Men of greater virtue were said to live the noble life in the fields of Elysium, especially those who were a family of gods and heroes.
Makes sense, I guess. Mm-hmm. Pretty easy to get on board with.
Yeah. The Isles of the Blessed were conceptually identical to Elysium, and so they had quickly become conflated. Those islands are to the far west of Europe, so potentially the Americas.
Yeah, we're living in heaven here.
There's the Canada. I was just...
See? Now we're covered.
Descriptions of the Elysian fields vary with every classic author, but it's traditionally admitted that each resident might see it differently as they might lead different lives there, doing as they please. I feel like the Elysian fields were mentioned in Gladiator.
Absolutely they were.
So I watched Gladiator when I was far too young to watch Gladiator, and it disturbed me because it was so gory, and I've never watched it since.
Yeah, you're going to want to go back.
Am I going to want to go back? It's really... I remember being very gory. There's 2 points that stick out in particular to like this day, and I saw it probably 20 years ago. So
it's a classic, but it's not required for being a cultured human being.
So back to the Hellenic afterlife. Usually the talk of the dead was about disembodied spirits, but there are a few stories that all heroes have been taken to their immortal home in their flesh suits.
It sounds all right.
Cool. I don't know. I wouldn't mind keeping my flesh suit.
Yeah, there's not a lot of discussion of a physical resurrection in Greek literature classically, but there are a few that actually talk about reincarnation as well, though that's not actually a popular theory back then, but it was a thing that some classic Greek writers were talking about.
Well, they better hold on to their hats because they're about to get a resurrection story that's going to blow their minds.
Right? And ruin their religion.
And ruin basically everything.
But because we're talking about a polytheistic world, all these cults that we talked about earlier lived together in the same cities. They accepted each other's practices. When they traveled, like I said, they offered sacrifices to local gods and each other's gods. without complaining about their own god not being respected in any particular temple. The idea of one true God, as is very commonly understood in the world today, because monotheistic religions are the vast majority of people's faiths in the world, all of this was completely foreign to these people. It wouldn't have even made sense.
How could one person do all of this? I don't get it.
Right?
It's a lot of work. So we mentioned earlier that this is a series on, air quotes, dead religions, but all of these religions have been revived because people.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we could debate on how much people believe, just like we talked about Jediism versus this is just something cool to be a part of. But there are active Hellenic revivalist groups, mostly in Greece. So the reign of Constantine II in the 4th century is where most historians point to the sharp decline of Hellenistic paganism, though I'm sure for centuries afterwards you could find the odd person.
Definitely. More likely in rural areas. In cities, there would have been a lot more force to, hey, you're going to be a Christian
And we
now.
mean force to be a Christian.
Yeah.
So basically it died out. The Supreme Council of Ethnikoi Hellenes was established in 1997, and they have revived these practices. They do perform sacrifice as we food and wine and milk for the most part. I have not heard any cases of human sacrifices yet.
Because that's a crime.
That's a crime. And they sing hymns to their preferred god. In a Vice video that I watched, they actually had a lot of problems because the Greek government didn't actually recognize it as a religion until just 2017. So just 5 years ago. So they couldn't actually worship properly because all of these temples are tourist sites. And it's still actually a bit of a point of contention.
No kidding.
Because you can't just be pouring milk on a tourist attraction. Hi, Stonehenge. Have some milk.
Yeah, that might be a problem.
So they
for
are
some people.
petitioning to hold stuff at the Parthenon, and they're like, no, you really can't do that. But they spoke in this little Vice. You can find this Vice mini, they're mini documentaries. They talked to the minister of religion. He's like, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you can do whatever you want, but we also have to protect our historic landmarks. So there is obviously freedom of religion in Greece. Mm-hmm. There are other groups around the world, but again, it's predominantly Greek in Greece. And there's, just like before, there's no central body, and many of these practices and traditions come from the study of what happened historically. There are other groups in addition to the Supreme Council of Ethnikoi Hellenes. That's just one of many. And one point I found really interesting in the documentary was that, and smart of them, is while on the surface it seems nationalistic, they are very much separating themselves from right-wing nationals that every country seems to have a problem with. So it is not that. And I just want to be clear about that. So while it is this very Greek-centric, obviously, Greek religion, it is not that.
It's not the problem.
It's not the problem. It's people literally dressing in togas and singing songs about their favorite god or goddess.
Which sounds pretty all right.
Right? I love a good toga.
Right.
It's like a moo-moo.
But more flattering.
True.
Depending on your personal body type. I want to talk a little bit about euhemerism before we close out.
Wrap up this number.
So Euhemerus was this fella who was basically, this way back, talked about how some of the gods were actually real people. And so euhemerism is the study of mythology from a historical approach, which
almost anthropological, where you're trying to
almost
solve it.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky. a lot of the gods we know are just personification of natural phenomena.
Apollo, yeah.
But some of the gods throughout history across various cultures, some of them were people. And so the trick is figuring out which ones actually were. And the tomb of Zeus on Crete is one of those things that is kind of the backup for the argument that maybe Zeus actually was a real person, that he was a Minoan, and that maybe his name, or at least he is called commonly in this area, Velkanos, which is kind of interesting. And honestly, I think the whole idea of euhemerism is fascinating. Unfortunately, there's a severe shortage of historical records to really support any of the fun hypotheses. Was Zeus a king who deposed another king and conquered the hearts and minds of Greece? Or maybe not, who knows? Or maybe the story of Zeus killing Cronus is an allegory for the cult of Zeus supplanting the cult of Cronus. We don't have a cult of Cronus. We don't actually have any evidence that there was a cult of Cronus. But because of the story that we have, that might be an allegorical representation of a cultural movement.
Well, and then we also get into, I forget his name, but from Hermeticism, where you're an amalgamation of...
Like Hermes Trismegistus.
Hermes Trismegistus, where you are an amalgamation of, Hermes Trismegistus was an amalgamation of deities, but you could potentially, and this is an argument for Jesus as well, where you're an amalgamation of people who were real smushed together. So now you're fictitious, but you're based in fact. So there's also that, which I'm sure falls into this as well.
It's definitely connected studies. Yeah, it's all really complicated and really interesting.
As an atheist, I think it's a really good explanation to how a lot of this developed. Right? And I think this is going way, way back to our episode on why people believe what they believe, but even just wanting to be part of something bigger. And if you can rally around someone and make them bigger and better, based in truth, maybe not that they did, that's, something that's kind of easy to rally behind.
Sure.
This is interesting. I feel like maybe we do a whole episode on this too.
I think we definitely could.
We should add to our list
Yes.
before we forget.
Well, that's more or less what we can fit in the time that you give us.
Episode. But as always, feel free to pop onto our social media or our Discord with recommendations or suggestions for episodes. Do you want to hear more about Apollo? We'll do a whole episode on Apollo for you. You let us know. So that is Instagram, Facebook, and Discord.
And Patreon. Don't forget Patreon. We would love to get a little extra support. If we got enough support, we could put out a new episode every week. That'd be fantastic. And if subscriptions aren't really your thing, maybe we could sell you a shirt or a tote. We got so many options on Spreadshirt and so many options to just be our friend and give us money.
Join the community, ask questions, learn more. Everything's on our website now.
Man, we're getting organized and legit.
We're moving on up in this world. So yeah, but your support means everything to us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.